Okay, hello everybody. This is now the second class of the second course of Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. And we're particularly looking in this course at the modern period, including early modern, and then there's several different phases of the modern. And so part of what's fun about doing this is that we get to look back at earlier moments of our own modern tradition where there's a kind of modernity happening, but it's not yet our modernity. But there's parts of it that relate to what we're doing now. And so it gives us an opportunity to look back with the eyes of Minerva at the dusk, to allude to Hegel's famous remark that the owl of Minerva flies at the dusk, that historical understanding comes retroactively after the actual events and their extraordinary lived messiness have occurred. You can have the cleaned up viewpoint at the end and look back and recognize retrospectively what were the important moments. And so particularly with the figure of Isaac Luria, who we're looking at, and the tradition associated with him that we're going to look at today, this is especially the case because his speculative version of Qabalah introduces really a kind of, in his notion of Simsum, or a kind of divine absence as the basis for the positive emanation of creation, a kind of anterior negativity within the divinity itself, where God becomes a kind of creative nothingness. This is extremely radical and is in many ways a break with the tradition of what's called the via negativa, the Platonic, speculative, mystical tradition of the medieval period, of which there's Islamic, Christian, and Jewish versions of this. So it kind of forms a common milieu, although it has its particular cultural expressions at the same time. So what Luria is doing is something that seems superficially familiar to the tradition of via negativa. I'll say more about that in a bit, but in fact is a radical rethinking of the very roots of that very tradition. Isaac Luria was born in 1534. He died in 1572 at the age of 38, relatively young. He lived for 7 years on an island in the Nile River in Egypt, studying Qabalah, and had this cottage that he lived at that was a kind of hermitage. And he corresponded with people about his Kabbalistic ideas there. He was reading the Zohar and other texts and developing his own exegetical approach at that time. And eventually he was invited to move to the Safed community in Palestine. And he lived there from 1570 to 72, maybe about a 3-year period during which he was the leader of that, of the Kabbalistic circle that was associated with that community. A fellow by the name of Moses Cordovero, another important figure in the Kabbalistic tradition, was the previous leader of the community. He passed away a few months after Luria arrived, and the community was looking for a new leader, and Luria became the new leader. He did not really write much himself. There is some kind of partial commentary on a text of the Zohar. I'll get to that in a moment. And there's some prayers that he wrote that are currently part of the standard Jewish liturgy. And so it's important to speak of a Lurianic tradition associated with Luria rather than his own writings, because in a way he's not the author of his own stuff. In a way he's similar to Socrates in that sense, another person who didn't write anything particularly important himself, but the books about him by other people, often who were students of his, those are then the important sources on what his philosophy is. In the case of Isaac Luria, his main disciple, Haim Vital, who succeeded him, again, also as leader of the Safavid community, he wrote a number of books on Luria, including the most important one called The Tree of Life at Haim, which circulated extensively in manuscript form, and then there were books also written about those books. And basically, this particular doctrine, this reinterpretation of the medieval Zoharic Kabbalistic tradition, which has now been updated for early modernity, the Lurianic tradition, becomes normative throughout Jewish communities in Europe, particularly by about the middle of the 1600s. And it's one of the last major movements of Jewish cultural revival that spread universally throughout the diaspora. So the Lurianic tradition, when we call it that, we're referring to a kind of interpretive strategy, a kind of hermeneutical perspective, and it relates or refers to a set of issues and a set of some interpretive strategies to address those issues. So the main trauma that's being addressed within the Jewish community is the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. And in many ways, I think 1492 is a good date to pick if you want to choose the moment where there's the beginning of the modern age. At what year does, particularly from a European perspective, what is the date that ends the narrative of the medieval feudal post-Roman period, and now something new is happening that then more and more takes on its own narrative and its own trajectories, what history is or is about. And 1492 is the date of the discovery of the New World, so-called, by Christopher Columbus, which begins the an enormous period of mercantile expansion by the various European powers called colonialism, in which they eventually take over the entire planet. And it creates a new global culture as a result of that, with European culture as the hegemonic form of that global culture. And it's perhaps, I mean, it is coincidental, but it is symbolically not, interpretively, hermeneutically, it's not at all coincidental that there's this attempt by the Christian rulers of Spain, who've just kicked the Muslims out and recreated this new thing, the Spanish Empire, the union of Castile and Aragon, those two crowns. And this is now going to be the Spanish Empire. And they also, in the same year as the New World is discovered, is that they order all the Jews to be expelled from Spain, who've been part of this wonderful medieval pluralistic culture. And so it's almost kind of like a repeat of the diaspora that occurred at the end of the Roman War, with the war between the rebels in Palestine, the Judean territory, and the Roman colonial overtake of that area. And at the end of that, all the Jews were expelled from Jerusalem. Now there'd already, and this stands for then the larger dispersion of Jewish populations throughout the world, and particularly the area of the Roman Empire at that period, and then later the Islamic Caliphate as well, especially. And so, of course, there'd been an earlier spread of Jewish populations as early as the Greek empires that were created in that region after the conquest of Alexander the Great. So there's a constant diffusion of this population group, but it has its own cultural narrative, at which there's certain nodal points that take on a special narrative significance. And so the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 is then felt as the onset of a new opportunity for messianic expectations within the Jewish community. The idea being that whenever things get really bad, things are going to get, there's going to be some kind of restoration, perhaps of Israel, or this happens also after the Holocaust in World War II, where a lot of Zionist religious kind of there's this kind of aura that surrounds the founding of the state of Israel, always kind of a sleazy settler project that has its own kind of colonialism associated with it. But this ideal that there could be a kind of restoration of the ancient homeland is, of course, a perennial theme of at least some versions of Jewish spirituality. So there's a group of exiles from Spain who settle in Palestine in the 1500s, and particularly there's a group of them who have strong messianic expectations in this community called Safed, which is kind of in the northern part of present-day Israel. And they have this ideal which derives from the Zohar and other traditions. There's already a kind of, you could call it Hasidism. Perhaps it'd be better just to call it a kind of pietism that was already going on in medieval Jewry in Europe. And so there's this pietistic element linked to communal prayer and communal observance of the Torah, of the mitzvot, the various observances of that. And the idea is that if they could get just this one community to just be perfect in their Torah observance, the Messiah is going to come. That's going to trigger it. And so it takes on this magical, frankly, significance. And this becomes, in combination with the already Neoplatonic kind of underpinnings of the Zoharic tradition within Qabalah, that there's this whole kind of pietistic theurgy that they're practicing at Safed that then becomes normative in modern times for what Qabalah is seen as being. And so the leaders of this community in Safed, they engaged in extensive Kabbalistic observance and speculation. And according to Gershom Scholem, and I do highly recommend his book in general, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, as the really essential text to be as a starting point for the study of this subject. He's got a great Luria chapter in this book. And according to him, medieval Kabbalah was not really a popular movement. And it also tended to de-emphasize messianism and concentrate on not so much the end of time, but speculation about the beginning of time, the creation. And so you get these lengthy exegetical accounts in the Zohar, for example, where there's a whole lot of time spent with theosophical and esoteric interpretation of the creation account in Genesis, for example. And so their focus is on the beginning, the creation, the beginning of time. And what's interesting then about modern Kabbalah, particularly as represented with the Lurianic tradition, is that you have the revival of a popular messianism, and it's emphasizing the end times. But what's interesting is that in order to meditate on the end times, you meditate on the beginning of time as well. You establish a parallelism between these two. And so then you reread the Zoharic accounts of the beginning of time in terms of how that's a prophecy of things that are going to occur then in the end of the time. And so you see it all carries forward into this new or refreshed, perhaps. There's always been occurrences of messianism throughout the history of Judaism. And so the Lurianic tradition emphasizes messianic eschatological role of the Kabbalistic master, who's called the Tzaddik, particularly associated with Sephira Yesod, and they're said to be the foundation of the world. Sometimes it's said that there's a certain number of these people that existed at any particular time. And what I think is important about this is that this is all linked to the experience of modernity more generally, not just in Jewish culture, but in all cultures that are caught up in this historically new experience of globalization. And an experience of modernity is a kind of apocalypse, an apocalyptic time. And this is based in part also on a kind of Gnostic awareness that this very state of affairs is the case. So the realization that modernity is a kind of apocalypse is itself a kind of, is part of that gnosis also at the same time. Like in Hegel, where spirit is consciousness's knowledge of itself, that it is consciousness able to know itself, and so on. It's a kind of cognitive loop. So in turn, this means that Qabalah takes on, at least implicitly, a kind of revolutionary world transforming mode. And so the practice of spiritual observance facilitates tikkun, or restoration, of the primordially intended form of the universe that got broken. More about that in a moment. And so tikkun is in fact a kind of Gnostic theurgy. And of course, in a Jewish apocalyptic context, it's associated with the coming of the Messianic time, but then the apocalypse is the Messianic time. So it's all these ideas converge. And of course, if this sounds familiar, it's because this is the basic matrix of ideas for Thelema as well, as a kind of new age or new eon where the transformations of modernity are experienced as a kind of magical apocalypse that brings about a kind of coming of a new spirituality that allows human beings to rediscover their own divinity. And their own reality is the existential ground of the significance of the world, what Heidegger calls being, with the capital B. Oh yes, one more thing, which is, what's this thing called Judaism that I keep referring to? And of course, often there's a perception, both among Christians and Jews, that it's this ancient primordial thing that goes back all these thousands of years. And there are certainly texts that are quite ancient, but the most recent archaeological investigation of this subject indicates that there's no archaeological evidence for a widespread popular practice of Jewish observance in a form that we would recognize much later than about maybe 2 centuries before the Common Era. And if that sounds shockingly late, let me say, first of all, that the text of the Torah is, of course, older. It's just that this is written by priests as a kind of idealized vision of what they imagine the community surrounding them, the ethnos, or kind of national grouping of people settled around Jerusalem where they're writing this. What they think those people should think is their history and the kind of practices that they should be following. But there's no particular reason to think, especially based on the archaeological record, that most or even many of those people were paying necessarily much attention at all to what the priests at Jerusalem thought, that were the compilers of this text called the Torah, thought that they were supposed to think or be doing. And so, and that there are a few nationalist revivals, you could say, within the periods of time where otherwise this coastal area is almost completely overrun and absorbed by these other larger civilizations, whether that's the Assyrians or the Greeks or whomever. But at a certain point, for cultural reasons, there's a decisive revolt against the Greek Empire at that time that controlled that area. This is after Alexander the Great. His generals carve out different little empires from the territory he conquered, and these become Greek-speaking and culturally Hellenized areas. And Hellenization is a little bit different than earlier. It's a new kind of cosmopolitanism that is more colonially displacing previous cultural traditions than earlier ways that your area would get overrun by your neighbors, and you'd be paying taxes to them for a few generations before things get shuffled around. And every once in a while, there's a larger player like Assyria or Persia that comes along, but you're able to maintain a certain regional autonomy, at least culturally, for most of those. Whereas Hellenism is a culture that then is being, and a language. And so people are now speaking Greek and reading these books and doing this thing called philosophy. And they're setting up all these bathhouses where they're having these lectures about stuff that's not part of your culture. And so there was a revolt called the Maccabean Revolt. And what happened is that there was, again, a kind of semi-autonomous area that was set up. And then that gets overrun by the Romans. But this idea that there needed to be a more uniform local, quote unquote, ethnic culture there to resist assimilation into Hellenism kind of takes hold, and this thing that we now call Judaism occurs, where Torah isn't just something that the priests are reading in, whatever the temple they have going in Jerusalem is, but it's something that is being read to the general populace, and that there's more general observance that's understood to have a certain form, and this gradually evolves into rabbinic Judaism, of which the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the temple priests, are kind of the earlier representatives of this thing that's formed that you can now call Judaism. And in particular, kind of the archaeological demarcator of that is observance of kosher diet, which there's no evidence that kosher diet was particularly being practiced in Palestine, again, prior to about 2 centuries before the beginning of the Common Era. But then it starts being practiced, and there's no pork bones anymore. And you can tell that people in this community are observing kosher. Oh, well, they must be practicing this now generalized religion, quote unquote, that's now called Judaism. So anyway, so that of course continues into the medieval period and then into modernity and has its own whole trajectory. And then of course it's also alongside of and in continual conversation with these other cultures that it's embedded within. And then these other larger Gentile cultures also are always in dialogue with these Jewish elements that are also part of what's going on. And it gets to a point where the majority religion in the Roman Empire and the societies that evolve out of that, whether that's Latin Christendom or the Islamic Caliphate, are basically versions of Torah religion. It's just that they've been extensively revised to accommodate this different political cultural context. They've been reformatted to become a kind of state religion, which was never precisely the same function as Judaism, at least after the destruction of the temple. And then Judaism can't function as a state religion, and instead it functions as this other modality in a condition of exile. But Christianity and Islam, they can be state religions, but then they have to change the format of what they're doing. And so then you see, so it's all this complicated intercultural conversation that in fact goes all the way back. So Luria emphasizes the theme of exile, and particularly of a kind of dialectical self-contradiction, kind of ontological brokenness that is the site, at the same time, the site of redemptive magical power. So this is then, therefore, also kind of a profound break with the logos of Greek metaphysics. The ontotheology, as Martin Heidegger calls it, the ontotheology of the metaphysics of positive being, is replaced by a negative figuration of the absolute as the Hebrew word ayin, nothingness, not or nothing. And it's also linked to this idea called simsum, which means a kind of evacuation. And in a way, this is also, from an intra-Jewish literary point of view, it's a break with the rationalism of Maimonides and the accommodation to Aristotelianism as a kind of Jewish version of metaphysics. But then what's interesting about Luria is there's a kind of break with that accommodation and a re-radicalizing of a kind of contribution to the spiritual dialogue that is more uniquely based to this, on the specificity and the particular tensions that are occurring within specifically the Torah tradition, and moving away from some of the smoothing out of that occurs in Greek Platonism, Aristotelianism, and then the absorption of that within the Jewish tradition, represented particularly by Maimonides, but also other figures. Medieval Jewish intellectualism is quite comfortable with Greek philosophy. But there's a reevaluation that's now occurring with Luria, and things jump off the train track and moves in a different direction. So the organic hierarchical world ontology of Platonism is replaced with a historically novel, we might even say modern, world conception of reality as an incomplete totality, inherently broken, primordially disrupted or chaotic, which is then capable for that very reason of historical transmutation. And so you're no longer stuck within the cycles of historical time. There could be a fundamental rupture with past history, and the new, the messianic, the novel, the modern can now enter history. And this means that Qabalah has this privileged status in particularly the Lurianic Kabbalistic tradition, has a kind of privileged status within the development of the culture of modernity itself. Because there's a sense in which modern subjectivity is, in this context, happening first, or being thought through or experienced first within the cultural experience of Jewish exile. And Gentiles are also experiencing it, but they're kind of one step further from being able to articulate it. And it first gets worked out in a more kind of self-conscious and sophisticated way. That viewpoint or understanding has to come from a kind of a subaltern viewpoint within the larger system of hegemony, because the larger hegemonic Christian Gentile culture is invested in perpetuating its own ideological correctness, normativity, and so it's going to be when things start to really change and get called into question, it's going to resist responding to that in a way that's creative and engaging with the issues. But if you're not part of that hegemonic group, if you're part of this other subculture, you're in a position to be able to get ahead of the game and recognize the signs of the times, as it were, and take up a more adequate prophetic and get more traction in terms of what's happening, to be able to think through what's occurring. And so that's why in modernity you have this whole kind of thread of a certain, you might call it Judaic critical thinkers, whether that's Sigmund Freud or Karl Marx or Baruch Spinoza, or in this case, one of the very earliest ones, Isaac Luria. And then, of course, they interjected certain moments into a larger European globalized conversation, which then picks up on that in one way or another to reject or engage with. But then the conversation is then very dramatically furthered by these particular figures. Ludwig Wittgenstein, another figure in this tradition. And therefore, I think that's also a reason why Qabalah legitimately has a privileged status as a revolutionary spiritual tradition for Thelemites, in terms of looking back on our antecedents, particularly antecedents, not just in ancient times, but in more modern times as well. And by engaging with that, we're able to understand the larger narrative of modernity, in which Thelema is also a more recently emergent participant. And our own spirituality is oriented towards these similar issues. So Luria saw his doctrine of Tzimtzum as an esoteric interpretation of the Zohar, particularly the Book of Concealment, the Sifra had Seninta. And he thought his interpretation was based on direct visionary communication he was having with the prophet Elijah, who was telling him how to interpret these things. So Elijah, the figure of Elijah, is like his Isaac Luria's holy guardian angel who's delivering him, or his if he's Muhammad, it's his angel Gabriel. Or if it's Crowley, it's the hidden master Iwas is delivering this information. So if the Zohar and other medieval Kabbalistic works see the creation in terms of the orderly Neoplatonic-ish emanation of an exterior divine fullness, which then emanates downward to create the physical universe, Luria instead views creation as a primordial catastrophe of the retreat or withdrawal of the divine, rather than its orderly emanation, or a kind of primordial absence of the fullness or pleroma of God as the basis for creation. Let me directly read you. This is from Gershom Scholem, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, page 261, from his 7th lecture, Isaac Luria in his school. Quote, according to Luria, God was compelled to make room for the world by, as it were, abandoning a region within himself, a kind of mystical primordial space from which he withdrew in order to return to it in the act of creation and revelation. The first act of Ein Sof, the infinite being, is therefore not a step outside, but a step inside, a movement of recoil, of falling back upon oneself, of withdrawing into oneself. Instead of emanation, we have the opposite, contraction. The God who revealed himself in firm contours was superseded by one who descended deeper into the recesses of his own being, who concentrated himself into himself, and had done so from the very beginning of creation. So that's the first basic Lurianic idea, the idea of the Tsimsum, the divine contraction. And this means that the universe itself is in a state of or condition of exile. So there's a kind of universalization of the experience of exile of the Jewish community, which is now, there's a kind of interpretation of the world horizon now in these terms. So the condition of exile does not occur, it occurs outside the divine. And so it can then be the site itself of a kind of reemergence of the divine within history. This also means that deen or judgment, which sets boundaries or allows for form to emerge, is something that's internal to God for Luria, rather than something that emerges later in the structure of the tree of life with the two pillars. Now, this is really important because it means that there's, before the formation of the four worlds for Luria, there's a fifth world. Like if the four worlds are fire, water, earth, and air, this is the fifth world of spirit. And it's the world of Adam Kadmon, the primordial body of God. He also calls it the world of pointed lights. And says that the vowel pointings of the letters in the Torah are associated with this world. And the problem, though, is that this spiritual primordial world from which the tree of life is supposed to then emanate as the form then of the body of Adam Kadmon, as these three pillars that line up to make the form of a divine human body, which is then supposed to form out of this world of Adam Kadmon. The first primordial creation is now occurring within this space, this evacuated space that's been opened up by Tsimsum. But this primordial world is mixed with the seed of the Qliphoth. It's mixed with the seed of evil, because deen or judgment is within the Godhead. And so for the Qliphoth to be separated out from the light, there has to be a kind of alchemy of this twofold process of the breaking of the vessels and tikkun, or restoration. Okay. Breaking of the vessels. So this is based on Isaac Luria's reading of the Zohar's account of what are called the kings of Edom in the book of Genesis. Okay, what's that? Now this is important because this is going to reoccur within the Golden Dawn initiation system. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. So the kings of Edom are the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and their allies, and they're in the southern part of what's now Israel, in what's going to become this desert, but at this point it's this plain, and they're what are called the cities of the plains. And they're in a war with Abraham and his people, and Abraham also has this ally named Melchizedek, who's apparently also a high priest of the Lord, the Bible says. Anyway, so Abraham and Melchizedek, who in the Kabbalistic tradition is also seen as the type or archetype of the high priest of the temple. So he's like Moses before Moses, but he's also the magical Kabbalistic operator. So he's also a figure of a magician as well. So he and Abraham get together and they fight this battle with the kings of Edom and defeat them. And then subsequently in the narrative, God destroys the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah for their sin in the land. And all that southern area becomes a desert and what's now the Dead Sea, which is this very barren area of the coast. Or I should say inland from the southern part of Israel, there's this desert area. And it's so desolate that there's this myth that God caused this devastation there. because of the kings of Edom who were wicked and lived there. So in the Lurianic interpretation of the Zoharic interpretation of this part of the book of Genesis, the kings of Edom represent a previous world of creation that was destroyed to make way for the present one. It was this previous period of unbalanced creation, which then had to be swept aside to then give way to the current created world. This destruction is the breaking of the vessels. And this previous unbalanced world was this world of Adam Cadmon, this world of pointed lights. And now that has to, because it still contains the seed of the Qliphoth in it, it has to be disrupted so that the current created world can happen. And then Tikkun can occur that will separate the Qliphoth from the reformed regular Sephirotic tree of life. So then you'll have the two trees separated from each other, tree of the Qliphoth and the tree of life, Adam Cadmon, the restored divine human body of Adam Cadmon, the Kabbalistic body of God, tree of life with its Sephira in the form of the human body. And then that's the messianic world to come. That's the utopia of the end time. Then is when that separation has been occurred. But first there has to be the breaking of the vessels. Okay. So for Luria, what happens then is that in the world of pointed lights, you have all this divine light that is then gathered together in vessels to form the Sephirotic structure of the tree of life. So you're in the world of Adam Cadmon, and now this body is going to form in the form of the Sephirot. But these vessels to hold the light and bound it are made of this deen or judgment, which is the seed of the Qliphoth, the Sidra Achra, the other side of the dark or Qliphotic side, backside of the tree of life that emerges out of an imbalance of Qabalah. So these vessels are then made up of deen. Again, because they set a bound and limit to the light so that it can then, of course, form the present world. But then the seed of the Qliphoth is already within the vessels, which are therefore imperfect, and they rupture and break. And then everything blasts apart, like the Big Bang at the beginning of the universe. The symmetry is broken, and all the shards of the broken vessels that contain the fragments of the light then materialize and form the present world. So everything, according to Luria, goes fine at the level of the supernals. Kether, Hoklah, and Bina form without breaking. But then the whole lower tree, from Hesed down, the Sephirotic vessels have broken and fallen into a great abyss, which is dominated by the Qliphoth and formed out of the fallen shards of the broken vessels. Okay, and if this sounds familiar, it's because this is the Golden Dawn or Thelemic version of the Tree of Life. So this is the same, in many ways, kind of account that Crowley is working with in, let's say, the Vision of the Voice or other of these texts. And again, this is precisely because this is the context where the previous mixture of light and the seed of evil can now be separated out. And the now purified light is restored to its originally intended Sephirotic form. Therefore, for Luria, the structure of the Tree of Life is interpreted in terms of what's called the Partsufim, or countenance theory of the divine. So in other words, for him, mitzvot or observance is organized into an observance which is directed at particular aspects of the divine, which appear when you group different sephirot together. The phrase countenance refers to the phrase in the Bible where it says, "The Lord shall turn his countenance upon you and bless you." And so the idea is that as you reform through tikkun, through theurgic prayer and observance, you reform the Sephirotic tree of life by doing that. And then the groupings of the various sephira then form aspects of the divine that you can then interact with. And in particular, he's focused on the particular Partsuf formed by the lower Sephiroth of the tree, Hesed and to maybe Yesod. And this is called the Zaire Anpin, which is equivalent to Adonai or Yod He Vav He, located or focused in Tifereth. And then the idea in the Zohar is that Tifereth and Malkut have been separated and they have to be brought back together. So the Shekinah and Malkut has fallen like Eve, and Adonai, who's like Adam and Tifereth, these two have to be brought back together. Or in Luria, the Shekinah is identified with the figure of Rachel in the Bible, that character. So Rachel and Zaire Anpin have to be brought back together, but this is exactly equivalent to the reunion of Adonai and Shekinah in the Zohar, which are Tifereth and Malkut, which have been separated from each other in the fall. But then this is the same narrative really as the Zohar. It's just been, as you see, updated. And then this is especially achieved through a kind of ritual communal prayer, which takes on a kind of ceremonial, magical, in our sense, function. And so that means also that tikkun is a kind of, in theurgic terms, is a kind of demiurgy. What I mean by that is that the individual person who practices tikkun is operating as if they're a divine being. They're carrying on God, the divine work, through their activity. In fact, they are God's activity in the world, in a sense. It's where that's located. And so they have within them the Kabbalistic magus, therefore is able to wield the power of creation through the knowledge, for example, of the divine fourfold name and its permutations, and all the standard medieval formula then come back into prayer. Abraham Abulafia's practical Qabalah of different type of recitations. You can make the golem, all kinds of stuff that you can be doing magically. And the intention is then to end the exile of the Shekinah, because the Shekinah is also the body of Israel. Is also Israel in exile from the Holy Land. These are brought back together, and then the temple can be restored through the worship, which then, in a sense, is the temple worship. And then it's as if you're in the Messianic times, you've restored it. Let's take a look now at a text here. Just a moment. Oops. There we go. Okay, Tree of Life. This is Haim Vital. So, Henry, could you be so good as to just start us off right here, where it says, regarding the matters.
Regarding the matters of the infinite, blessed be he, how did the worlds that were emanated from him begin to be emanated? Furthermore, there is a great question about which all the Kabbalists were divided. There were those who wrote that the 10 Sephirot are ordered in 10 levels, each one following the other and below the other. And there were those who wrote that they are arranged in 3 columns, right, left, and middle, with 3 Sephirot, Chokhmah, Hesed, and Netzach, above each other in a line on the right, 3 Sephirot, Bina, Gevurah, and Hod above each other in a line on the left, and 4 Sephirot, Ketzer, Tiferet, Yesod, and Malchut in a line above each other in the middle column.
Okay, Dan, if you could read that next paragraph.
There were also many who understood that they are actually in the form of circular wheels, each one inside the other, which one surrounding and encircling the other. Examination of the words of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the Zohar and the Tikkun, as well as the Book of Splendor, the Sefer Bahir by Rabbi Neshwan ben Hakdana, yield evidence of varying and contradictory expressions in their writings, some of which point one way and some the other. The latter Kabbalists tried in vain to investigate this, but were unable to do so, because it is a very great and difficult question. They were overwhelmed by it, saying, since the infinite is uniform, completely uniform in
Okay,
all
stop there for a
aspects.
moment.
Mhm.
Now we're transitioning to another section. Basically, in this first part, Hayim Vital is noting that there's three descriptions of the emergence of the Sephira that he's trying to reconcile. So there's the idea of the Sephira as, they're one above the other in a line. And then there's the version where they form the pattern of the human body in three columns, which is the tree of life. And then there's a further version where they're in concentric spheres like this. Okay, so those are the three versions of the emanation. And he's trying to explain how these can all be reconciled. So, and this is then going to allow him to tell the story of how the universe was created, because it turns out that there's different emanations at different times. So first comes the initial Tzimtzum at the beginning of time. So Taryn, if you could read that beginning where it says, since the infinite is uniform, where I have the cursor.
Since the infinite is uniform, completely uniform in all aspects, it would be inappropriate to apply to him the terms up, down, front, or back, because all these attributes imply that there is a limit, a border, a boundary, and a measure in the light of the supernal infinite, God forbid. We know that the light of the infinite penetrates and passes through the thickness of each and every Sephira, and is within each and every Sephira, as well as surrounding them from the outside as described in the Zohar, in the portion Behar, the faithful shepherd.
Etc. And then if you'll read the bit, the cause of all causes.
The cause of all causes is above everything. There is no God above him or below him or to the four sides of the world. He fills all the worlds and he surrounds them from every side.
Okay, and so this is like in the Sefer Yetzer, right, where it talks about an abyss of height and an abyss of depth. And all the dimensions of what Paul Foster Case calls the cube of space. And so they're all part of the immensity of the divine. And then on the next page, where we're going to pick up again where it says, as for the difference between these opinions. Henry, if you could start there.
As for the difference between these two opinions, whether the Sephirot are arranged in 10 levels, one above the other, or are in parallel lines, this will be fully explained later with God's help when we deal with the subject of the world of points. There we will explain how, before their reconfiguration, Tikkun, they were ordered one above the other, but after the reconfiguration, they resembled the picture of the three lines as described above in the second opinion.
Okay, so there's a kind of order where first there's the Tzimtzum, the evacuation, and then the Sephira first emerges the line, because it's a line that extends from infinity to the center that then allows for the creation then of the world to occur then at that center point. But then what happens is, as the tree is then supposed to be forming of the body of Adam Kadmon then at that center point, there's the rupturing of the vessels. And then retroactively then, after the disordered creation of the actual messed up world that we live in has then occurred, then through Tikkun, there's the attempt to regenerate or restore the Sephirotic form of the tree, which was supposed to represent how the world was supposed to originally be ordered, but it got broken and messed up. Now that's interesting because it means that the specifically Sephirotic form of the tree, which is also the order whereby you see the different parsufim or aspects of the divine that you're worshiping, is a retroactive function of the Kabbalistic practitioner and their worship. In a sense, it's socially constructed by the observance of Torah. And Gershom Scholem notes that there's been a kind of inversion from the usual monotheistic assumption that God comes first and then human beings come after and then worship God. And there's a sense in which for Luria, God is creating God's self through the prayer, through the worship of the community. And that Adonai doesn't actually like exist until he's posited by the prayer of the worshipers that then cause him to magically exist for them, because it's their gaze looking up from Malkut that creates the parsufim on the tree. And in fact, this is described as a whole kind of process in Luria. Let me find where he talks about it here. This is elsewhere in Vital's book that I don't have up here, but I'm going to read you a passage. He says, all of the Sephirot have a desire and a longing to turn their faces towards the light. However, whenever a Sephirot coalesces, as the tree is forming, then this vessel turns its face downward, because now that it had become a vessel, its light was separated from its root and was not strong enough to look at that light face to face. It turned its face downward after it became a vessel, because it could not look up at the higher light that had removed itself from it face to face, but only through its back. Okay, it's a little bit complicated, but basically what he's saying is that as each Sephirot is formed by the one above it, the light from above is too strong and the Sephirot has to turn around. And so it's having been posited by the Sephirot before it is kind of comes after the fact as it's looking back at it. And then it looks down, so then the cascading can continue to happen so creation can occur. And so what that means is that in the Lurianic system, the advancing emanation of the light always presupposes at each stage the trees of life having a corresponding negative phase of Simson, which clears a space for the light to shine further downwards, before which it can't emerge. So emanation actually is presupposed by Simson. Simson, the negative comes first, not the positive in the process. The positive only happens retroactively after the negative withdrawal has occurred. This is a remarkable inversion of traditional metaphysics, because there's a kind of also an asymmetry between these two phases, the emanation and the Simson. And this imbalance is resolved on the side of the negative action. In other words, the top-down emanation of the tree of life turns out to be ontologically founded on a more primordial, backwards process of Simson, which Vital calls the face-to-face or the face downwards in the process, where the tree is actually being first seen or viewed from the bottom up, in terms of which its top-down progression can then happen. And I think that's really interesting. And we'll have more to say about that and why that's important as we proceed with the class. In the meantime, let's read some more about the Simson itself. So who was it who read last? Henry, you went last, so then it's Dan's turn, right? Okay, Dan, if you could read starting where it says the contraction at the center of the light of the infinite.
You should know that before the emanations were emanated and the creations created, a most supreme, simple light filled the whole existence. There was no vacant place, no aspect of empty space or void, but everything was filled by that simple light of the infinite. It had no aspect of beginning or end, but was all one simple, completely uniform light. And this is what is called the light of the infinite, or
Terry,
Ein
if you could
Sof.
pick up on when it arose.
When it arose in his simple will to create worlds and to emanate emanations, to bring out the perfection of his actions, his names, and his attributes. For this was the reason that the worlds were created, as we explained in the first inquiry of the first branch. Then the infinite contracted itself at its midpoint in the exact center of its light, and after he contracted that light and withdrew away from that midpoint to the sides surrounding it, it was left a vacant place, an empty space, and a void like this. That contraction was completely uniform around the midpoint, so that the void was uniformly circular on all sides. It was not shaped like a square with fixed corners, because the infinite had contracted itself like a circle uniformly from all sides. The reason for this is that the light of the infinite is absolutely the same, completely and totally uniform, so it had to contract itself uniformly from all sides, and it could not contract itself from one side more than the others.
All right, and then Henry, if you'll pick up on the following page where it says the ray of light from the infinite into the void.
After the contraction that we described above, the void, vacant, and empty space remained in the exact middle of the light of the infinite, as mentioned above. As a result, a place was already there for what would be emanated, created, formed, and made. Then one straight line extended from the light of the infinite, extending from its circle of light from above to below, descending and developing into that void, as shown in figure 6. The top of this line extends from the infinite itself and touches it, but the other extremity at the lower end of this line does not touch the light of the infinite. The light of the infinite extends by way of this line and spreads downward. Within that empty place, he emanated, created, formed, and made all the worlds, every one of them. This line is like a single narrow conduit through which the waters of the supernal light of the infinite spread and are drawn to the worlds that are in the empty space of that void.
Okay, and then Dan, on the following page, if you could pick up where it says circles in the void.
Notice that when the light of the infinite extended downward into the void in the form of a straight line, it did not immediately extend and spread to the bottom, but extended itself little by little. That is to say, at the outset, the line of light began to expand. There, right when it started to extend in the form of a line, becoming circular like a sphere. The sphere did not, however, touch the light of the infinite that surrounded it on all sides. For if it had touched it, it would have returned to what it had been, and what would have been nullified by the light of the infinite. Then its power would never have appeared at all, and everything would have been only the light of the infinite. As it was in the beginning, therefore, the circular sphere is close to the circle of the infinite, but does not touch it. The emanated circle's main connection and attachment to the infinite emanator is through that line that was described above. This is the way the light descends and extends from infinite and flows into the circle. The infinite surrounds and encircles it on all sides because it too has a circular aspect surrounding the circle, but distant. To turn
All
my
right.
phone, sorry.
Distant from it as mentioned above. And we can see that, ta-da, here it is on the next page. So here's the space evacuated by Simpson. Then you have the emergence of the Sephiroth as a line. And then these then form these circular aspects. And this is then the world of Adam Kadmon, or the world of pointed lights, which is the fifth world preceding the four regular Kabbalistic worlds, Absolute, Luria, Yetzirah, and Asya, which are now supposed to form based on the form of the Sephirotic tree of life. The form of the tree of life is the human body. But once you get past Bina, as that's starting to form, it breaks because of the breaking of the vessels. The shards fall, the universe is formed in the middle here. And then there you go. We're back where we started. And then Taryn, if you could read where it says, "It is clear and obvious."
It is clear and obvious that many different kinds of worlds were emanated, created, formed, and made, thousands upon thousands and myriads upon myriads. Every single one of them is inside the empty place that was described above, and nothing is outside it. Every world has its own individual 10 sephirot, and every sephira that is within each world is also made up of 10 individual sephirot. All of them are in the form of concentric circles with no end to their number. They are like the layers of an onion with rings inside each other, the way circles are illustrated in geometry books. The aspect that connects all the circles is that thin line extending from the infinite and passing through them, descending and spreading from circle to circle to the ultimate end of them all. The light and the inflowing abundance, Shifa, that are necessary for each one of them are distributed by way of that line. We have now explained the circular aspects of the 10 Sephirot.
Okay, so that's the basic outline of the Lurianic system. Now, what's interesting about that is that this reappears in the Golden Dawn initiation system, specifically in the Philosopher's grade in the Path of Pei. And what happens there is that you have the doctrine of the kings of Edom, which remember represent this the world of Adam Kadmon, which is a world of unbalanced force because it contains the light contains within itself the seed of the Qliphoth, the seed of evil, because as this primordial world is assuming form or shape, there has to be a bound or limit to the light. But then the light can't be contained by the vessels that are fashioned from the deen or judgment within God. And so those vessels rupture and you get this kind of catastrophe at the beginning of creation that has to be restored through tikkun. And this is all basically alluded to in the Philosopher's ritual of the Golden Dawn. So right here where it says page 138, the Hierophant tells the Hegemon to admit the candidate. As the Hegemon is admitting the candidate, they say, the river Kishon swept them away, that ancient river, the river Kishon, oh my soul, thou hast trodden down strength. Okay, this is a reference to the defeat of the kings of Edom, which is also conflated in the Golden Dawn with the breaking of the vessels, and also the defeat of Leviathan by Yahweh at the beginning of time, which is a myth that is included in the Psalms, but is otherwise not directly narrated in the Bible. It's just occasionally alluded to. It's this ancient myth that there was a battle between Yahweh and this sea monster called Leviathan at the beginning of time. Sometimes it's called Rahab. And the defeat of this primordial monster allowed the world to be created. And of course, there's parallel here to the myth of Marduk in Mesopotamia, where at the beginning of time, this dragon Tiamat is defeated by Marduk, who cuts her in two, and then the upper half becomes the heavens and the lower half becomes the earth, and the waters that are contained within Tiamat are loosed. So that's also about this river that's washing everything away. Okay, so the candidate enters. This is the path of Mars. So the Lord, we're told, is a man of war. Lord of armies is his name. That's a reference to the divine name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh Sabaoth, Yahweh, Lord of the celestial armies or hosts. The Hierophant says, ere the Eternal instituted the formation, beginning and end, existed not. Okay, so that's the primordial Ein Sof, the space where everything's undifferentiated. There's no beginning, no end. Therefore, before him, he expanded a certain veil. Okay, that's a reference to the Simsum. And therein he instituted the primal kings, world-appointed lights. And these are the kings who reigned in a dome before there reigned a king over Israel. Israel standing for the regular period of creation. So there's this prehistory, before there reigned a king over Israel. But they subsisted not, because they were made of unbalanced force. When the earth was formless and void, beginning of time at the beginning of the book of Genesis. Behold, this is the reign of Edom. And when the creation was established, lo, this is the reign of Israel. And the wars of titanic forces in the chaos of creation, lo, these are the wars between them. From a light bearer of unsupportable brightness proceeded a radiant flame hurtling forth. I think this is the line that then descends into the space of Simsum. Like a vast and mighty hammer, those sparks which were the primal worlds. Again, this is the world of pointed lights, like the stars. And these are the sparks which were the primal worlds. And these sparks flamed and scintillated a while, but being unbalanced because they contain the seed of the Qliphoth, because of the Deen, which within God, they were extinguished. Since lo, the kings assembled, they passed away together. They themselves beheld, so they were astonished, they feared, they hasted away. And these be the kings of Edom who reigned before there reigned a king over Israel. Okay, so then there's all this stuff about their destruction, and there's hailstones and flashing fire, which is a reference to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction of the cities of the plain. And then the channels of the waters were seen and the foundations of the world were discovered. Okay, that's the opening up of Tiamat, which looses the primordial waters of creation. And so then the world can be built up. Okay, so I just want to point that out because we're going to have more to say about that later, because this relates to McGregor Mather's concept of what he calls negative existence, which he relates to the what he calls the three veils preceding Kether on the tree of life. And then Crowley reinterprets that in terms of this thing he calls the Kabbalistic zero. But the background to all of that is already in the Golden Dawn initiation system, the preservation of this Lurianic doctrine concerning Simsum. And it's hidden here in plain sight in the 27th path of Pe, which of course is also the blasted tower, the Tower of Babel, the destruction of the ancient kings, that all these symbols are cognate. And it's laid out pretty much explicitly right here in the 27th path in the Philosopher's Ritual. We'll have more to say about the Golden Dawn's interpretation of Kabbalistic material and that really fascinating theurgic Kabbalistic synthesis, hermetic Kabbalistic fusion that's occurring in the Golden Dawn magical system. And we'll have more to say about how Mathers, and in what context, learned Qabalah and why it's important that he did, and how that feeds into the Golden Dawn and why that's important, and what on earth Emanuel Swedenborg has to do with that, which it turns out he has quite a bit to do with it, but we'll get to that later in the course. Right now, we've got about 15 minutes more, and I want to open to questions, comments, and discussion that anybody has about the admittedly complicated material that we were looking at, but I hope you can see how this feeds directly into the magical theurgic tradition that we're part of. But anyway, if we want to talk about that a bit, anybody have any questions, please? Don't be shy.
Can you kind of
Yeah.
go over the breaking of the vessels again?
Okay,
Kind of-
sure. So you've got this primordial world of pointed lights, and then the regular four Kabbalistic worlds are then supposed to appear with the Sephirotic tree of life, like in the Zohar, with Kether all the way down to Malkuth. And the idea is that this is supposed to be the way the universe is to be created in the traditional, organic, hierarchical, intended way. And Luria has this idea that something went wrong at the beginning of time, and that didn't happen. The intended form of creation where we would have lived, where the Garden of Eden would have continued and there wouldn't have been a fall, that didn't happen. And instead there was a fall and a disruption, and we exist in the current actual chaotic world of material history. But then that's precisely the creative conditions for the alchemical operation of the separation of the darkness and the light, the theurgic alchemy that can then actually cause the actual creation of the Sephirotic tree as the way that it's supposed to be. But then that's the microcosm. That's the divine being of the Sadiq, of the ideal Kabbalistic sage, who then embodies basically the presence of the divine within time. Is the stand-in for the Messiah, for the divine human being within history, the actual goal of history, rather than the messed up prehistory that we've actually found ourselves in up to this point. And so in a way, Luria's covert argument is that the conditions of modernity create this new creative condition where the stasis of medieval life is broken, and there's these new conditions, and this is now the opportunity for magical tikkun to then bring about the utopia that has been forestalled. But what happens then is that you have this primordial world of lights, but it's unstable. It explodes from its own instability. It's like the primordial monoblock that preceded the Big Bang, and some kind of instability emerges because of something that's happening within that process, whereby the strong nuclear force separates out from the other three forces, and it causes this basically infinite explosion at the beginning of time that happened everywhere at once, and we're still being thrown out from that primordial explosion. That's the breaking of the vessels. That's this moment where the original pleroma, the divine fullness of whatever was this point of this condition of maximum physical density and heat that was the conditions of the Big Bang, that withdraws, and we're thrown out into this void, this open space that now creation can occur. And so then the human body, the human form, the Sephirotic form of the tree, then is the divine form as reconstituted within that space. So anyway, again, how the breaking of the vessels occurs, which is that because for form to emerge, there has to be a bounding of the light, but that bounding implies deen or judgment, which is the seed of the klipoth, is excessive judgment that overwhelms mercy or compassion. That's the sidra akra, when Qabalah, that side of the tree becomes unbalanced in relation to the rest of the tree, and that causes what Kenneth Grant calls the night side of Eden, the reverse or klipotic side of the tree, to then emerge from the sidra akra as the unbalanced form of the tree, which in a way is our reality until it's reformed into the proper Sephirotic form of the tree. But that's what causes the breaking of the vessels. It's that primordially within the Godhead already is the seed of evil. This is the radical Gnostic non-dualism at the heart of Luria's theosophy. And when we get to Jacob Burma in the next class, we're going to discover that he has exactly this doctrine. Well, gosh golly, where did he get it? Well, he got it from some kind of Kabbalistic underground that was going on, that's influenced by the Lurianic tradition. That is what we're looking at. So even though it might seem that we're kind of doing this backwards, because we're even though Luria is before the Rosicrucian manifestos, but we're looking at them after. But what we're really looking at is the Lurianic underground, this kind of set of texts and ideas that are circulating in esoteric context of thought in Europe, which includes both Jews and Gentiles. It's kind of part of this conversation. And what happens is that the Rosicrucian manifestos set up this expectation that there's going to be this new revelation. And then the content of that revelation, which is the gnosis of modernity, you could say, is then filled in by a kind of trajectory that I'm arguing that emerges as its initial point in Lurianic Qabalah, this insight of Simpson, this negative or dialectical view of reality that supplants the earlier medieval organic hierarchical Platonic philosophy of the world, that gets ruptured and broken by modernity. And then being ruptured and broken becomes the basic experience of modernity. But then it's also the discovery that in a way, the world always was this way. We were kind of hypnotized in medieval society into this kind of magical universe that isn't our actual material conditions. But then that doesn't mean that magic doesn't still work, but it takes on this different configuration. And it becomes focused on the individual subject, the individual person as magical operator to carry out a kind of internal alchemy to bring about their own Gnostic self-actualization, otherwise modern magic. Hope that answers your question. Anybody else? Henry.
Building on that, can you talk a little bit about how the kings of Edom as like a myth or metaphor kind of like why are people relating it to the breaking of the vessels or equating them to each other?
Okay, well, you have a overlapping where what's originally a diachronic question, what happens at the beginning of time, a question of temporal, what order or certain temporal sequence of things is occurring. And as typical in Kabbalistic discourse, this discussion is transferred over to a synchronic context where a series of literary metaphors drawn from Torah or Jewish literature or myth then become what you're talking about to talk about this other cosmological issue. So the reason you have the kings of Edom is that you have the overlapping or synthesis of a series of metaphorical tropes, which include the fall in the Garden of Eden, the battle between Leviathan and Adonai, the destruction of the cities of the plains with the battle between the kings of and the war between Abraham and the kings of Edom, and the destruction of the Tower of Babel, and also the flood, which is also a destructive event. And so all these motifs are combined together as a way to develop an esoteric exegesis of what happened at the beginning of time, which is then also equivalent to what's going to happen at the end of time. And that's how they're working this out. That's how the hermeneutics of this work. And that's why it's so fascinating too, because it's different than the more it works a little bit different than the way rhetoric works more in accord with the Greek logos, where you're supposed to have this sort of ordered argument where you start somewhere and then you work through these stages and come to the end. And Kabbalistic symbolism, rather like the Talmud itself, is a conversation between multiple divergent, not always agreeing viewpoints that you enter in media res, you enter in the middle of it. And it kind of is a conversation that never started and never ends. And you're just in the middle of it, and there's all these reference points in play. And then there's this kind of creative play of the metaphors where you generate this kind of account of what happened. And it works in all this mythical register that then becomes a kind of psychology as well. So then it's not only about these myths, but then it's about how you're relating to these myths in your prayer life, in your sacralize life with your family or community, which you're doing all these prayers at home, you're having the Sabbath, you're eating your food a certain way that sets your group off from others. And all these things sacralize your life in terms of these myths that then relate to this larger interpretive horizon that is telling you who you are and what you're doing. And I'm just trying to sort of relate that to the larger narrative of modernity trying to understand itself and how that relates to the practice of Thelemic magic as part of that conversation. So does that help understand why these characters from the book of Genesis are suddenly appearing in what might otherwise appear to be a cosmological argument? How these different tropes are kind of interwoven with each other. Henry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I'm trying to make my follow-up question more concrete. I think I want to understand more about what sort of as far as the like what specifically is the trope that's being shared between all of them, and is it this sort of negativity, right, or this subtraction or exile as the kind of foundational myth,
foundational basis for creation, for then positive creation, right?
Yeah.
That there's this disruption that occurs at the beginning rather than an orderly process. And also to tie all these things together on a literary basis, the basic kind of central esoteric text is this thing, the Sifra, the book of the concealed mystery, which is one of the books in the Zohar that is translated and given a commentary on by Mathers in the Qabalah Unveiled. But it's also a text that was very important to the Safed community. And in a lot of ways, Luria's taking up of medieval Qabalah and translation into its new modern form, this particular strata of the Zohar, this particular text and the particular themes that it's dealing with, which is that it's an interpretation of this text from the book of Genesis. Remember that the Zohar is a commentary on Torah. So it's taking different passages from the scripture and then developing this esoteric. So this is the part of it where it's commenting on this section from Genesis about the kings of Edom. And so that all relates to this kind of primordial overthrowing of these unbalanced forces at the beginning of creation. And then Luria is developing his own myth on that basis to then expand and develop that in this new kind of interpretive direction. But that's the text that people are coming back to, that's in the Zohar, that Luria is reading, that then Mathers is incorporating into the Philosopher's Ritual, that is then these various factors, if you're looking for the text that everybody's reading, that is kind of coordinating all these ideas that otherwise seem to be all over the place, this is the place where that's occurring within the larger literature of the Jewish Qabalah.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Okay, we're coming up on 3:30. We may have time for one more short question or some comments. Or Taryn, if you just want to take us out, if you have anything you want to add at the end of this to close us out, if you do.
Yeah, just a small comment and then a little bit of housekeeping. Just that I think the understanding of this sort of mythopoetic illustration of, we're gonna take a story to illustrate a concept, I think is really beneficial to keep in mind, not just within the context of how Luria is developing the Qabalah, but also how, again, like you said, like Mathers then takes a piece of this and it sort of continues on in this lineage of ideas, into Thelema. And I think that it's really important to remember that these are the stories we tell to illustrate an idea, but they're not necessarily, I think we get into dangerous sort of anti-Semitic territory when we take things that are very distinctly from, you know, Jewish culture and then reinterpret them and express them as divine truths. I think that that's sort of dangerous territory. So just kind of as like a coda comment on our study of Qabalah within the Western Hermetic tradition, which I think is fine, but we always need to be sort of aware of how we are very deliberately syncretizing or reinterpreting things and not allowing that reinterpretation to perpetuate negative biases towards a particular cultural and ethnic group. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there. Nathan, did you want to respond to that in any way before I do?
No, I think that's a good stopping point, and we'll be continuing on. And there's going to be a 2-week break, which I think we wanted to mention at the end also.
Yes, we'll be back January 7th. So everybody should be getting the link January 6th for week 3.
Okay, I think that's it. Thanks everybody for joining us. We're going to continue with Jacob Burma, who's a really fascinating figure we'll be looking at coming up next in 3 weeks. Hope to see most of you there, and everybody have a nice end of the year.